Good morning, everyone, or if you are coming from the US, good evening to you all. My name is Nadia. I'm from the Reactor here in Sydney. It is our morning time, hence the good morning. I just wanted to welcome you to today's session. Just a couple of things before we get started. If you do have any questions, please feel free to leave them in our Q&A. I've popped a little note in there already, so you should be able to find that. Today's session will be recorded and put into our YouTube channel within the next couple of days, so I will leave that link in there for you as well. Today we are joined by Saveen, who is a group product manager who's helping envision and deliver the future for enterprise analytics via Azure Synapse. So he'll be taking you through a presentation today. But before we go to Saveen, I'm going to hand you over to Cheryl, who will be moderating today's session. Cheryl is a senior content developer at Microsoft. Thanks, Cheryl.
Thank you so much for that intro. I'm excited to have this conversation with Saveen. First, a little bit about myself. As she mentioned, I'm a senior content developer for SQL here at Microsoft. So what that means is I spend a lot of time creating, testing, and developing documentation, some of which I'm sure you're probably familiar with. Whenever you look up Microsoft Docs, that's usually a member of our team that's using it. In addition to that, I have interests in mental health and wellness, and I've also been doing some conference speaking as well. Saveen?
Thank you, Cheryl. So everyone, my name is Saveen Reddy. I've been with Microsoft only 25 years now. And I've been working for the last quite a few years on data, and specifically, I'm a group program manager in Azure Synapse Analytics. And so I'm really happy to be here today because we've taken our Microsoft on a long journey with analytics, and talking more about what you can do with Limitless is just a key passion of mine.
Wow. Well, without further ado, let's get started. Saveen, why don't you kick us off with your presentation?
Yes, thank you, Cheryl. So, the title of the session is about what you can do with a Limitless, analytics service. Before we get into what you can do with a Limitless analytics service, it is a great idea for us to just take a step back and remember a little bit about what happens that are causing the limits. Like, what are they in a traditional service? And you can categorize them in many ways. I pick these 5. The traditional limits we face are about the size of data, the formats of the data, metadata systems, how you consume analytics resources. So for example, how you provision them, and then how analytic systems interop with other systems. And the net effect of all these is these limits create certain kinds of problems. And the fundamental problem they create is a cultural problem about how people collaborate together. And of course, they create that classic data silo problem, where data is simply locked up in different places and into different teams, and it cannot be used. So I want to take a more expansive approach when I talk about Limitless, to show you first, like, what are the fundamental problems that are really not technical, they're almost really cultural, and how people work together.
Saveen, I'm thinking about what you're talking about the limits and some of the challenges with that, but I want to take a step and kind of get some of those foundation words out of the way so that we can have a good understanding. Serverless is something that we hear a lot about today. Is serverless really a better way? Is it better than the provision model?
Well, great question. So on the slide I have, what they are both a kind of is a consumption model for resources. So let's start with the classic consumption model, which is called provisioned or dedicated or cluster-based. And that's the most easy to understand, which is, you allocate a set of machines or VMs or resources that are in a fixed number, and you reserve them for your usage to do analytics. Easy to understand how you pay for it, because you multiply each node you've allocated by the cost of that node per hour. Very easy, but as one of my colleagues likes to say, reservation by definition implies waste. And it's very true that when you put that box and you allocate those resources, you can't fill the box up enough most of the time to do what you need to do. In other words, you're spending money, but you're not getting the return on investment for it. So serverless is another approach. Now in serverless, you are not allocating resources. Someone else, in this case a cloud provider such as Microsoft, is running a very distributed system that has a large sort of ocean of resources. And then when you submit work to it or you run a query, resources are allocated on demand to run that query. It's very similar to how the cell phone system works. Everyone uses this, picks up the cell phone, and some capacity to run that call is established. So Cheryl's questions about serverless versus this provisioned model. And is serverless the future? In a broad sense, yes. We at Microsoft have been running a multi-exabyte scale data lake that is purely built on serverless thinking and serverless architecture. And it's allowed us to be efficient and scale to amazing size and scenarios. However, serverless exists on a spectrum with provision, and some people will find the provision thinking is more easy to understand because it's the classic way people do things. The future for both of these things is to move together. Provision models will take on the flexibility of serverless models. Serverless models will become more predictable and understandable like provision models. So the future, they become closer, but still, depending on what you're trying to do, you may pick one over the other.
Now that's an interesting approach. So we're talking about serverless. What about the limitless approach? I want to see, how do those two things correlate?
So the limitless is, again, about removing barriers at least these 5 dimensions, right? And serverless, the dimension we're working on here, is the ability to move beyond fixed limits of processing. If you're provisioning resources, you can only do as much as your provision capacity, meaning if you have 10 VMs, that's all you can do. And so serverless removes that limit because you're pulling from a much wider pool, a much distributed, as like an ocean, or a larger pool of resources that are available on demand. And that's how it removes that limit.
Wow, I'm starting to get a picture of what you're talking about, and I see it all kind of coming together. It begs the question, though, as we are looking at all these different types of technologies and data types and formats, how do we get into this space? What do you think people should be doing to start to adapt their data or their environment to get into this limitless space? It sounds incredible.
Well, Cheryl, I should back up a little bit because I think I didn't fully address your question. I want to go back and talk about what Limitless brings. I kind of over-focused on consumption model. So Limitless across those 5 dimensions means going from megabytes to gigabytes to petabytes, and yes, eventually exabytes. It also means removing the limits around formats. So classically, you have simple tables. That's classic T-SQL world. Then we want to move into simple text formats like CSV or JSON or XML. Then you have structured formats that are column-oriented, like Parquet. And then an evolution of that, Delta-like formats. And then, of course, media. This is audio and video and pictures. And, of course, documents, large corpuses of billions of documents. And I'll talk an example about that later. So all those have to be processed by analytic systems. The third is metadata. So classically, we deal with any analytic system. Metadata is all about essentially databases and tables and views. So what happens is that contributes to those silos is that engines can't query each other's metadata. A great example is it's often true that if you have a table in Spark, it cannot be directly queried by your SQL analytics engine and vice versa. So that's another limit we want to remove, the limits between different metadata systems. I already talked about consumption model. And finally is the limits between systems. So when you talk about an analytic system, they're often in their own space. And they're not easy, for example, to get data from non-analytic systems like operational databases or file stores that are either on-premise or in the cloud or have different formats. So a key aspect of removing that limit is making sure that an analytic service has many connectors and deep integrations with other services. And so now that I've sort of caught back up, I'll focus more on really, would you repeat your question, please, Cheryl, just so I have it straight in my head again?
Well, we were trying to consider, or we were considering, how do people become more involved if they want to get into this limitless space? And it looks like this slide kind of touches on some of those key topics.
Right. And these are different sort of things to explore doing it. And probably a great way of explaining how people can start is taking a look at a couple of scenarios here, which are, and I'm going to pick 2 of them. This first slide is a classic scenario that works well for Limitless. And this is really a scenario where you have a lot of data, or it doesn't have to be a lot, to be honest, but it's raw data that's landing in your data lake. And what people we see doing with Limitless systems is they're just using their analytics capacity to discover what's there. In fact, that's a very common problem customers tell us, is that they have data in the lake, they don't actually know what's in there, and they have no querying analytics system to help them understand it. So that'll help there. Once you have that raw data and you understand what's there, the next thing you'll do is like do some hypothesis testing. Like if you see a dip in sales in a certain state, you need to start processing the raw data and seeing, well, why might that be, right? And then you start, once you have that raw data, you start doing some other things. And so we've removed the limit for you to analyze and start testing. You start training models using machine learning to like predict, for example, sales or fraud, et cetera. But these are classic examples of what you do with raw data and data lake. And the great thing about this is you can do this without committing yourself to building a system and designing the full thing. In other words, it's exploratory and you can experiment and play. And one of our cultural things we do inside Microsoft is we want to encourage that kind of open source thinking of having data in the lake and just playing with it. And a key thing that we believe, and we've seen customers believe, is that data that they've been collecting that today they would consider waste or exhaust, like car fume exhaust, that they don't bother, they don't think about, they want to get rid of. Actually, that data that's landing in that lake that they think they might want to delete could turn out to be tomorrow's competitive advantage. And that's why removing the limits to analyzing that from scale and data model and formats helps customers find that competitive advantage.
Right.
And here's another example of how Limitless helps you really mash up things together that wouldn't have been possible before. This is a real scenario that a researcher at Microsoft worked on building in association with an educational institution. So the institution was concerned about DNA. Now, many you know that there are these little codes in DNA like GATTACA, all that, right? And those are DNA sequences. Now, we have in Microsoft, as a function of the way we run Bing, we have a backup of the web. We have a web document index with billions of documents. These are web pages, these are PDFs, etc. And so what this researcher did was he actually found a list of DNA sequences that researchers were saying, we need to know I'm interested in this area, who else is writing about it? He found that list. He found our index, this backup of the web, found every time a web page mentions those sequences, those little, GATTACA things, right? And then he produced this visual map of the human DNA. And you can actually point a mouse and click on the DNA. And when you click on one of these sequences, it'll show you here across the entire web, here's who's publishing research about the piece you're clicking on. So it's a great example that takes somebody that has domain expertise, DNA, someone else has expertise in, these, again, text formats, document formats, and then mashing up them together and then producing something that's usable as a dashboard, an exploratory tool. And again, this wouldn't be possible if you couldn't manage the scale, the data formats, the differences between metadata systems, all possible because of a Limitless type system.
Well, these are really great points. I mean, one of the things that I really appreciated that you brought out were these 3 key points from your previous slide, which were discover, explore, and experimentation. And those are one of the key components as companies and organizations start to dig through these data lakes, start to rediscover data that they thought they were going to discard or archive or feel like it wasn't useful. They now have this opportunity to be inclusive and bring all of those different areas and those different data sources together. I also love the point that you brought about kind of getting in there and experimenting with it. And what a great opportunity it is to have all of these resources and tools available to do that exploration. And it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like there's not a lot of cost associated with that exploration.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because, especially as what you're doing scales, you should think about and consider how you want to move forward. And I would say this, the first thing is It's great that you can explore, but even in the context of exploring and doing ad hoc work, you should think about it in a larger picture. And that means developing your organization's data strategy. And the first advice I would tell someone is actually have a data strategy. Think about it, and think about it now. This will get beyond you very quickly if you don't. We see that from customers all the time. They're already feeling behind. There are three key elements, and you hit upon one of them already, that I would like anyone who's thinking about going into the limitless world to think about. The very first one is security. It will be far better for everyone to start with a rational foundation for how you intend to secure your data and not get caught later. Very related to that is governance and compliance. Now, these days, it's more in people's minds because we have a lot of thinking around GDPR protections and privacy, but you must formulate a data strategy that deals with that. And then finally, cost. Cost is the most intriguing about Limitless because, you know, when you go back to what I talked about dedicated consumption models, dedicated models are simple to understand. You buy a set of things, nodes, and you pay for as long as you have those nodes. It's very easy to understand. But Limitless, so actually that kind of protects you because you can't spend more than you have nodes, right? Limitless can give you a large number of resources on demand. You may not even realize how much you're spending. So you have to develop, and we have added in our Synapse product, policy to help you understand and manage that cost. It's super critical. And let me give you an anecdote, which often happens when you do not think about the cost and don't have those controls. We saw this in many analytics, other services which are serverless. And there's a classic problem where someone will suddenly discover 1 month their bill is 10 times greater than it was the month before. And they will call up the people running that service and they'll say, this is crazy. I didn't do this. How could I have spent 10 times more? And we've called them back up and you know, what's really funny happens is we said, actually, yeah, we found out what happened. And we'll say, did you have a sudden influx of users come in on, I don't know, February 13th? And they'll say, that was all the interns came in. Mm-hmm. All right, and the interns don't know about how to think about the cost. The policies weren't set to do them. So suddenly they had a cost overrun. Now we refunded the customers and everything, but you understand, without those controls, you could suddenly spike in funny ways.
Right, right. I like how you've connected those 2 points. I see the correlation between security and then controlling the cost. If you don't forecast or have a good model for security, it could definitely impact the cost and unfortunately impact your experience of using the service or product.
Exactly, exactly.
These are all really great points. I'm excited for so many different reasons with the technology and the capabilities. We know that we just did the GA last week for Synapse, and so there's a lot of buzz around all of the things that you can do. Is there a favorite that you have that maybe you've had an opportunity to explore that you really liked?
In terms of using the product?
Yes.
In like a scenario, you mean?
Sure, or just a feature that you feel will be the most beneficial to the customer, just in your opinion.
Yes, absolutely. So, you know, I'm going to go back on my slides for a second, just so everyone sees it. So it's really, if you can see my mouse, you know, our product started as an evolution of something called SQL Data Warehouse. That's all provisioned SQL capacity. We introduced serverless SQL pools. That's, of course, a serverless consumption model on top of SQL in Synapse. I would say if someone's really interested, that is the easiest and the fastest and the greatest return on investment way of getting into the space, understanding the product, and experiencing the culture, what it feels like to live in a world where you can just analyze data without having to think about it too much, right? So use serverless SQL pools. That would be my advice. And that's what we see customers doing.
And can I tap into that just a little bit more to say, how does someone get started getting into that space? What directives can you give us for that?
Very easy. So in our Synapse documentation, there's a get started documentation, and it has like 10 steps, and it will lead anyone through the process of understanding what Synapse is, how to kick the tires, how to use SQL, provision, serverless SQL, Spark, and it'll give everyone a good sense of what you can do with the product. And once you've completed it, you're unlocked and you're unleashed, and you can really start doing the more fancy stuff.
Wow. Yeah, I love the fact that you're able to direct to the documentation that has, if I recall, you said some very straightforward ways to kind of step through and see some of the technology. And I also believe you mentioned something about MS Learn had the ability to, there's some modules there that you could use as well. Yes.
We just released last week an updated set of training materials on Microsoft Learn. We're very proud of it. It's very extensive. That material is part of a larger learning module, or sort of role-based learning about data engineers. So if your interests are even broader than Synapse and you want to know about being a data engineer in Azure, take that learning in Microsoft Learn, and it'll cover key aspects of Synapse that are relevant to that role.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And Saveen, this has been really great information. I love the overview. I love the connective points about security and use and cost. This has been a great experience. I definitely encourage everyone to dig in and move forward into getting into this analytics space, because it looks like a great opportunity to explore your existing or newly acquired data. Now we're going to return back to Microsoft Reactor.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Saveen and Cheryl, as well, for sharing that amazing insight. If you are interested, Saveen will be back in another half an hour with a Ask Me Anything segment with Cheryl. But straight after this, we do have a session starting in about 10 minutes around hyperspace. So pop that event link into the Q&A. So thank you more, and we will see you then. Bye for now.
Bye, everyone.